former ECW, WWE, WCW, TNA superstar, Kid Kash. Kid Kash, how are you doing tonight?
Good, how are you?
Doing great, man. Looking forward to talking to you about, your full career, and of course, currently you're doing mixed martial arts. How's that going for you, man?
Everything is going well. Got some good coaches and a good little team I'm training with, and just taking one day at a time and learning a lot of new stuff and practicing a lot of old stuff. So it's I'm enjoying every minute.
That's awesome. It's nice to see another professional wrestler kind of take that turn into MMA. Of course, we've seen Bobby Lashley and Brock Lesnar take the turn into MMA, and now yourself. Who's one person that you'd like to face that's currently in either UFC or maybe Strikeforce?
Well, if I was in his weight class, I'd like to fight Faber, but I'm a little heavier than him. But just watching some of his stuff last night, just admire his explosiveness, and he stays on you. That's the kind of fighter that I am. Whenever I'm doing MMA, I just keep moving and keep staying on you and stuff. So, but there's always things you need to learn. I've always, I don't know. I'd like to take on that, what's his name, Diego Sanchez once, and see how that goes.
Now, that would actually be a tremendous fight. Of course, I've seen you in professional wrestling, and I can just imagine how you are in MMA. So, I wanted to, I wanted to talk, about pretty much your whole career. And growing up, were you a professional wrestling fan? If so, who were your favorites?
I was, but I wasn't like a huge fan. I mean, if it was on, I would watch it. I mean, there's probably like a span of time as a teenager. I might have watched it for like a year or two, but it wasn't like very religiously. If I was at home at the time, then I would watch it. If not, then I didn't worry about it or think about it. But when I did watch it, I mean, I grew up in the 80s and stuff. So I was like Wahoo McDaniels back in the day, who wound up being the first person I ever wrestled. Then I watched the Rock and Roll Express, of course, who trained me and got me in the business. And then there was Ricky Steamboats and the Arn Andersons and, those kind of guys. And then more to like Dynamite Kid. Those are the styles that I like, though. I watched all of those guys, and those guys were my favorite. But when it came down to wanting my style and my way of working, I kind of followed in different areas, like different wrestlers like Dynamite Kid and Benoit style, more of an aggressive type, even as a babyface, still being aggressive, but also using the selling of a Ricky Steamboat or a Ricky Morton, or even a Shawn Michaels, and then using technical moves, like Bret Hart would do, precision, So those are the guys that I kind of like looked up to, and actually pulled pieces of and followed and created Kid Kash.
Nice. Now, you actually brought up, Ricky Morton. What was it like training with him?
Honestly, I never really ever got trained. I just never got in the ring and went to a school or anything. I was fighting MMA years and years ago, and I just happened to meet Ricky, and we talked and just really hit it off. He gave me his number, and I never really used it, About a year went by, and I was wondering, I'd like to give it a shot, see what it was all about. The fighting was doing pretty good, but back in the late 80s, early 90s, it didn't really pay that well. I mean, it did if you won, but it really wasn't as over as it is now, So I tried out the wrestling. I gave Ricky a call, and actually I went to a local show where I was at, and I was watching the guys, and it was horrible. And I was like, even as a wrestling fan, I know what's right and what's wrong, and this is totally wrong, So I wound up calling Ricky, and come to find out we only lived about 3 hours from each other. And so every Thursday I would drive down and meet up with him, and kind of went from there. Just got in the back seat, and him and Robert, him and Tracy Smothers, him and Jerry Lawler, Billy Travis, all these other guys. Every week it was always somebody new, and I just sit back and listen to them. I watched their matches. I sold their gimmicks, their merchandise, carried their bags, just did all of that. And they would quiz me, ask me questions, that kind of stuff, ask me if I was paying attention to this and paying attention to that. And sometimes before a show, we would get in and they would show me a few lock-up holds and, just little things like that. But then one night I was just put on the spot, and I learned how to wrestle really technically in one night was just filling a spot and wrestling Wahoo McDaniels. And, man, that basically, it totally changed my life, It totally changed my life. It really did. He beat the ever-living hell out of me, and he broke my ankle, with a spinning toe hold. But it just taught me so much. Even though it was a bad experience, it wound up being a good experience.
Definitely. That sounds like a match that I would want to see. Now, you brought up, of course, you paid your dues the old school way. What do you think of the way that people are trained nowadays, how they're just kind of pushed in a school and pushed out of a school right onto the scene?
Yeah, well, there's on the independent level, you're basically opening, I don't know, I don't understand it myself. If you've never been anywhere or been to the top of anything, I mean, I really don't see how you can open up a wrestling school, and basically that's just a way for promoters who have wrestling schools and they promote wrestling shows to get out of, like a lot of overhead. Mm-hmm. Train the guys, put them over on their shows, make them that, and then never pay them, But you'll see that, in their work. Believe it or not, they might be good, but nobody yet on the indies that I've found has what we call a clue. And, it's just because they don't pay their dues anymore. Back in the day, you had to be good to be on a show. If you weren't good, then you watched, And that's basically how it went. But it doesn't happen that way anymore. Too many friends, training friends, and running shows and killing the business. But if you're in WWE, you don't really fight for, a position like you used to. Or even TNA, you got wrestling, their wrestling schools like WWE's training camp and stuff. That's basically how you get into the business with them. You have to go to their school now and basically be trained in the style that they want you to wrestle in, and then they take it from there.
Apparently, Casey Carnage wants me to tell you that Casey has a clue.
What's that?
Oh, Casey Carnage wanted me to tell you that Casey has a clue, he says.
Casey has a clue. Well, we'll have to find out one day.
How did you initially get involved with Extreme Championship Wrestling?
Rob Van Dam. I've known Rob for a very long time, and we just were always cool with each other from the first time we ever met. And I wouldn't say we're like the best friends, in the world, but he's actually, been one of the guys who's, looked out after me and stuff. I guess he respects my wrestling ability. I'm not 6'5", 300 pounds. I'm only 5'10" and a legit 185. So I'm never going to be a major superstar, but my talent speaks for itself. So he's always looked out after me in that sense, and we met, like I said, years ago, early 90s, about 1995. He calls me up one day, and he was telling me to turn to this certain channel, so I turned to the channel, and it was ECW, and he said, "What do you think about that?" And I was like, "That's great. What about it?" And he was like, "What do you think?" And I was like, "Well, it's cool. It's nothing that, I was already doing that same style on the indies down south, while they were wrestling up north. So, I mean, I was impressed with them, but I wasn't shocked, So he invited me up. He said he talked to Paul Heyman, and I'd been tag teaming with Ricky Morton a lot and doing a lot of stuff on my own. And, my name had already starting to get out there a little bit. And Paul heard about me, and when I came in, they gave me a match, and that was pretty much it. And then I was only there like a year the first time, and then kind of went back doing indies and Did a few WWE things, house shows and stuff like that, a couple of WCW stuff, and then I finally went back to ECW in like 98 and stayed for 2 years about 2.5 years till they closed.
Now, actually, you just kind of touched down on a couple of our listener questions that were sent in. One of our listeners wanted to know, did you enjoy your time as David Jericho?
What's that?
One of our listeners wanted to know if you enjoyed your time as David Jericho.
Yeah, well, that was my first gimmick. I was David Jericho from 1990. That was the only name I'd used forever. And I didn't change the name until like 1999. And that was ECW's doing, not mine.
Now, the other listener question that we had, and you kind of touched down on as well, was WWF, and it was, what do you recall from your WWF tag team match versus Too Cool where you broke both your ankles? What went wrong leading to the injury is part 2 of that question.
So whenever you're taking that move, there was a top rope Frankensteiner. When you're taking that move, of course, the guy taking it has to hold on, at first, but he also has to eventually let go. And that was it. I think it was either Brian or Scott. I think it was Scotty Taylor. Scotty Too Hotty. He was the one I was doing it to, and he just didn't let go of my legs. And when I came around, my feet were already flattened out, and it hurt me, but it hurt him too. He hurt his neck and shoulder there. So I think he was kind of like on the shelf for a couple of weeks after that. But, he came down and upside down and flattened both of my ankles right out, broke both of them right there.
Ouch.
We finished the match, though. I mean, I got up and was going to do a few things, but my legs wouldn't even hold me up. So I collapsed. And then I think Brian kind of took over from there. And he did the general spot and took over, and we finished the match. And then iced my feet down a little bit, got paid, and then drove home.
Now, my co-host Andrew has a couple of questions for you. So, Andrew, go ahead.
Yeah, hey, Kid Cash. You re-debuted in ECW in 1999 using the name Kid Cash. Whose idea was the name?
Actually, it was 1998, and I was David Jericho when I debuted again back in ECW.
My mistake, I apologize.
Yeah, 99 is whenever they came out with Kid Cash.
Okay, whose idea was that name?
Honestly, I think it was Joey Styles. It said something about me looking like Kid Rock. And Paul Heyman and Tommy Dreamer, I think they were producing the show at Paul's house. And I think they just said, you know what, that's a great idea, let's do it. I showed up for work the very first day. Tommy comes to me and says, hello, David Jericho, how are you today? And I was like, I'm fine, how are you? He goes, great, and he walks away, but then he turns around and comes back and he says, oh, by the way, you're no longer David Jericho, you are now Kid Cash, because you and Kid Rock look alike. And then he just walked away. So that's how it all became